Hey, going to talk a little bit today about the history of the Washington State spring bear hunting season. And you might think, well, that thing's been canceled, so why are we even interested in the history of the Washington State spring bear hunting season? Number one, it's interesting, but number two, I'm confident that it will return. The reasons why the spring bear hunting season existed still exist, and some of the commissioners now, it's a topic for another day, kind of the shenanigans that led to it being canceled 2 years ago. But it started as a management hunt. And, it wasn't called a management hunt then, but the reasons and the purposes and the intent of why that spring bear hunting season got started, much like how the current group of commissioners talk about, well, the science, what's the science, what's the science, what's the science. There was a tremendous amount of science that went into what became the spring bear hunting season. And it was not a general hunting season. In Washington, it was a permit draw with the intent of targeting black bears in the spring that were stripping trees on public land. It's interesting that this commission, this last year, was very receptive, very open. They worked on it for quite a long time. The Black Bear Timber Damage Depredation Permits program for black bear damage for commercial timber producers, right? Black bears don't recognize property lines. They don't recognize who has the land ownership. Black bears strip trees in the spring and eat cadmium. It's what they do. So that sugary pulp under the bark, they strip the trees, the younger trees, and it destroys the trees. And that damage, well, hey, the commercial timber producers understand that that's a financial loss to them. It's the same thing with the public land. And I think a large part of this current non-productive loop argument that the current commissioners are kind of diving into is, well, we're not hearing about the problem. And it becomes, if you scratch the surface of that, it's the old story of if a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, hey, if black bears are stripping trees on public land 7 miles back up in behind a locked public timberland gate, and then once you drive in 4 or 5 miles, then you got to hike 2 or 3 more miles in to find the stands of trees that they're stripping. And if you're, kind of savvy to the whole type of thing, you can just stay back and just glass the hillsides, and you'll notice where the stands of timber are being historically destroyed, because in real time, it doesn't brown out the trees fast enough. It's not a real sort of, they strip a tree today and tomorrow it's brown, and you can see that from a distance. But you can kind of see the historical areas where that's happened, because they'll just, a bear will just go through and eat 50, 70 trees a day. And the Washington State Supreme Court, within the last 2 years, there was a court case, and they reaffirmed that public land timber is held in a public trust for the state of Washington, and that public land timber, if you jump over to the public land timber managers' websites, in this case, DNR, they post this on their website, that public land timber is the primary funding source for Washington State's public schools, public universities, and public mental health facilities. If this commission needed a reason, they're like, what they're telling the staff now is, well, hey, if the staff can identify a new type of management need and then bring us some science, maybe we bring back the spring bear hunting season if there was some sort of new management need. But, we've talked about that whole bears stripping trees things on public land thing. Well, Washington State runs at a deficit. It's far in debt. A lot of government agencies are constantly looking for funding, and certainly public schools are constantly needing funding. And here it is, the commission is canceling the spring bear season, which targeted specific bears that were targeting specific stands of trees on public land, destroying those trees, And over time, hundreds of thousands, then it becomes millions of dollars lost to black bears stripping trees in the spring and destroying those trees. So the historical precedent of why is there a management hunt in the spring, it all gets tied into money, 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 money. And the commission will authorize a spring hunt to protect commercial timber, but for some reason, they don't believe that protecting public land timber, which is the primary funding source for Washington state schools, public universities, and public mental health facilities, is a sufficient reason to continue that spring bear hunt. So let's dive in a little bit to, what is the science? What led us to this? What were the studies? Where can I find those resources? And if a person is interested in this sort of stuff, it's kind of fascinating because it's not so much that bear hunters just want to go hunting bears. This was never really designed as a recreational hunt, albeit somewhere along the line they renamed it from being a boot hunt to a recreational hunt to a management hunt to they just kind of kept changing the names. But the permits were issued specifically for targeting black bears, specific black bears that were destroying specific stands of trees because the damage, the loss in value, the loss of timber is significant. And bears will just tear through a stand of trees, killing them. And then they'll go tear through another stand of trees. And they only do that in the spring. They don't do it in the fall. So hunting bears in the fall has no bearing on targeting bears that are eating trees in the spring. We're talking Washington State. We're talking Western Washington State. We're talking out on the coast of Washington State. There's plenty of other natural foods that they could be eating. The thing about cadmium is it's sugary and it's got protein. And any mammal, if they have their choice, and they can just gorge themselves on sugar, they will. Think about it. If mammals like sugar, people like sugar, bears like sugar. And that's what they're doing. They're targeting these trees because they're sweet, a lot of energy, and it defeats the myth that went around during the meetings that led up to the cancellation of Washington State spring bear hunting season by, in particular, one of the commissioners who really, really wanted to cancel it. And they kept pushing this myth. And because the process happened so quickly, it kind of caught people back on their heels, and the studies and the research wasn't able to happen fast enough to disprove this myth, but it has since been completely disproved. This commissioner was pushing the myth that hunting bears in the spring was not ethical, not sporting, because black bears are lethargic in the spring. Well, nothing could be further from the truth when, number one, it's a myth, but number two, bears that are on a food source are not lethargic. If you've ever walked up on an aggressive bear protecting a food source, they're anything but lethargic. Bears are territorial and they protect their food sources. And bears are aggressive critters. And also, you've probably seen it in children. Let children eat a bowl of sugar, they're not lethargic, are they? There'll be a little peak and valley, but the peak and valley doesn't really affect a bear's mood because bears have this instinctual predatory, they are predators, urge, drive to protect a food source. So although they might nap, because they're not going to stay awake for 3 months, you got to sleep sometimes. That doesn't mean you're lethargic. It just means, hey, they're mammals, just like any other mammal. They're awake for a while, they sleep for a while, they do whatever they do for a while, then they take a nap for a while. It's not a lethargic thing, particularly when they're protecting a food source. Okay, let's circle around to how did we get to this business of why was the Washington State spring bear hunt not a recreational hunt? Why was that hunt, for decades, that hunt has been a damage hunt. And the way it worked was, public land timber managers, they'd identify specific areas where bears were damaging a stand of timber. The people that got the permits were expected to get in there fast on it, stay on it, and remove that bear that was on that stand of timber. This was not, hey, you got a tag that works for the entire state. Just recreationally, you got a few days over the next 3-month season, go do a little hunt and see how it works out. The expectation was the people that got these things were healthy enough and fit enough to go into where they needed to go. And if you've ever gone into the forested areas of Western Washington or out on the coast, it's some ugly terrain. I mean, it's common that, if you're not on a logging road, your visibility could be anything from 2 feet in front of your face to maybe you've got 10, 15 yards of visibility. And you're expected to walk through this to a predetermined point where there's an aggressive black bear stripping trees, rampaging around, and protecting its food source. And it's not for everybody. A lot of people have in their mind their idea of what going hunting for bears is like. And in the western United States, a lot of it's open country hunting. I mean, it is. But Western Washington, where a lot of these permits came out, it is nothing like open country hunting. This was, you were going into thick stuff, you were hiking in a good distance, and a lot of people would go out a day or two, and they'd look at this stuff, and ick, don't want to go, not healthy enough to go, can't go. And it was resulting in the bears that needed to be targeted were not getting harvested. And it became something of an issue. So I'm getting a little bit off course. We'll come back to that in a future video, but I want to dive back in, and I'm already getting out towards the end of how long I want this one to run. So I'm gonna hold up a couple of books, and this is pretty much where the history is. Jump over on any of your favorite websites where you buy books. eBay's a great place to go to get started. First one here, Black Bear of Washington. Some on the commission actually know this book. This was put out by the Washington Game Department, which was the precursor name to the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. 6-year study. It involved lots of state agencies, University of Washington, Western Washington University, involved the feds, involved the Forest Service, involved the tribes, involved the big commercial timber producers. This one really dives into the history, the biology, the science of black bears, and in particular with a focus on bears' urge and behavior in the spring that leads them to destroy trees in search of cadmium rather than going off to other natural food sources. And it's that destruction of trees which has a tremendous financial loss to commercial timber producers and anybody who cares about the funding source, the primary funding source for Washington State's public schools, public universities, and public mental health centers. Public land timber, Washington State Supreme Court reaffirmed as recently as 2 years ago, public land timber is held in trust, and is the sale of public land timber is the primary funding source for Washington State's public schools, public universities, and public mental health facilities. It should be protected, particularly in a state that has a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous deficit. And the government agencies in Washington that are responsible for managing black bears, managing black bear damage, managing public land timber, the public land timber managers, they should be a little bit more concerned with getting the Washington State spring bear hunting season back, in my opinion. Next up, probably one of the biggest sources of information about spring bear damage on trees was this book, The Education of a Bear Hunter by Ralph Flowers. The interesting thing about this is Ralph was a professional bear hunter for the timber companies for over 20 years. And the book, he kept a lot of notes. He did a lot of journaling, and he killed over 1,000 bears in his lifetime. So he's got a lot of experience targeting black bears that are stripping trees, causing timber damage in the spring in Western Washington and out on the coast. And so he compiled just massive, massive, massive amounts of information and data and recorded it by journaling over a 20-plus year career. So he had a lot of experience being around these bears, living around these bears, dealing with these bears, seeing what their habits were, their patterns were. How did they do what they do? What were they eating? What was causing some of their conduct and behavior? This is a great, excellent book, and it reads very, very well. And you'll learn a lot about just the forest, what kind of foods are in the forest, what kind of foods do bears eat, what other food sources could they have been eating, do they eat? Because not all bears strip trees in the spring. Not all bears target coniferous trees in the spring and strip them. So, what led to certain bears doing it and other bears not doing it? And because he was out there doing that work, it really is just a treasure trove of good data about black bears in the spring, stripping trees, causing timber damage. And then the guy that got Ralph into it, who was basically the guy before Ralph, who was basically one of the very, very first people to work for the Forest Protection Association for the Washington State Timber Companies, was this guy, Bill Hewlett, Big Bill Hewlett. Great book. It was written by, I believe, his nephew. I love the title of the book, Born Under a Stump. Great book. Get a copy of it. It's a fast read. It's a lot of fun. But again, this was a guy who was a professional bear hunter for a very long time, and it gives a lot of insight into black bear timber damage in the spring in Washington State. All three of these books are specific to Washington State black bears engaging in timber damage. And when we stop for a minute and think, Washington State, there are books and books and books written about black bears destroying timber in the spring. And if it wasn't a significant problem, if it didn't lead to significant financial loss, I don't think people would focus on it as much as they have here. These studies, Black Bear Washington, it took them 6 years to conduct the study, took another 3 years to compile the data, put the book together. Department used it for a very, very, very long time. So these are important source material. And what goes on in Washington may not apply to some other state where you might be. But a huge part of the economy out here, a huge part of how our state funds our schools and our mental health facilities is public land timber. And it is uncomfortable to think that the voting majority on this commission find it perfectly acceptable to continue and to pass and to make sure that it continues the protection of commercial timber from black bear damage in the spring. But they canceled it. They don't feel now, because they're still saying, hey, we talked about it. No, we don't see it as being a problem. We don't see that as being something we need to address. For public land timber, which, Washington State Supreme Court reaffirmed it just like 2 years ago. Washington State timber, Washington State public land timber is held in a public trust, and it is the primary funding source for Washington State's public schools, public universities, and mental health facilities, public mental health facilities. So just 3 good books, kind of goes back to where this all began. In case you're like, who is this dude talking about this stuff? I'm a dude who's read these books quite a bit, and I'm an old man. I learned a lot from them. The stuff that it talked about 60 years ago, it still goes on today out in the woods. And it is truly the old story of, if a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, public land timber is gated off. You don't get a key to get up in there. Yeah, people can walk in and go hiking and stuff. But again, it's not that everybody can't walk up an old gravel logging road on public land timber. A lot of people do. But it separates out a lot when you're going to have to walk off that gravel road, walk into real thick stuff, knowing that you're going to walk a couple of miles to go in and target a specific black bear, destroying a specific food source, and black bears defend food sources aggressively. This is not something where that bear is going to be removed with a high-powered rifle, with a big scope, taking a 200-yard shot. The timber in Western Washington is thick, and you're doing real good if you can get a shooting lane that's like 15 yards in that stuff. It's just thick. And you're going to walk up on a bear that's causing a bunch of timber damage. That's what that permit program was for. And that becomes the fork in the road. We'll talk more about this later. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for watching. And until we talk about spring black bear hunting in Washington State again, thank you so much. Remember, black bears, they're wild animals. They're wild animals. Stay safe out there.